shared responsibilities to take the global economy out of its current mess.
Our key needs are to transform our economies, to stop digging natural resources and selling raw material.
No region of the world has moved to industrial economy status without passing through the transformation of the agricultural sector.
Welcome to the 2020 Virtual African Economic Conference, jointly organized by UNECA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations Development Programme, and the African Development Bank. Physical distancing, curfews, lockdowns, travel restrictions, schools, and business closures. These measures were necessary at the time of the pandemic. However, they also have disrupted tourism, trade, business operations, commodity prices, and global supply chains. COVID-19 has affected 4 out of 5 local businesses, with direct negative impacts on employment rates and economies suffering a loss of up to 3.4%. We needed to act. UNECA, UNDP, and the African Development Bank rapidly launched unprecedented COVID-19 response plans and mobilized their assets to support health systems, crisis management, and respond to socio-economic impacts. Besides a $2 billion response facility from the UN, UNECA worked with governments to think strategies and gather analytics to enable African countries to plan for COVID-19. The UNDP provided life-supporting medical equipment and even smart anti-epidemic robots that can screen up to 150 people per minute and detect abnormalities. The African Development Bank helped countries respond to the shocks with a $10 billion COVID-19 rapid response facility to shore up the continent's health systems and mitigate its social and economic impacts and build resilience to future pandemics. Because now is the time to think about how we can build back a better Africa post-COVID-19. Let's share best practices of innovative strategies that must be adopted to accelerate progress towards inclusive and sustainable development. Let's learn how to leverage digital tools and services to respond to emergencies and spur inclusive growth. Let's reflect on ways to rekindle cross-border cooperation and develop inclusive value chains and industries. COVID-19 has reiterated that the time to accelerate Africa's development is now. Our continent and its people are counting on us. It's time to break away from what we know as the normal way of doing business and crafting development projects. The 2020 African Economic Conference is the forum that will open the discussion on how to maintain the development gains on the continent and chart a concrete way forward. Welcome once again to the 2020 edition of the African Economic Conference.
Hello and welcome to this special broadcast. I'm Kenneth Ibomo, and it's the opening ceremony of the African Economic Conference. The 2020 edition of the African Economic Conference is jointly organized by the African Development Bank, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And it will be held virtually from the 8th of December to the 10th of December this year. This year's theme is focusing on Africa beyond COVID-19 and accelerating towards inclusive and sustainable development. The conference will bring together various stakeholders, including policymakers, researchers, to examine the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and also measures to mitigate the recovery of the pandemic for African countries. This year's conference is focusing on how African countries can build that much needed resilience and be better prepared to deal with future shocks. And it will offer the best practices from Africa and elsewhere on how African economies can accelerate progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and aspirations for the Agenda 2063. And to do the opening remarks, first we'll have Vera Songwe, is the UN Under Secretary General and Executive Secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, to share opening remarks.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Glad to see you and happy to welcome you to this African Economic Conference. Your Excellency, Sahle-Work Zewde, President of Ethiopia, honorable ministers and ambassadors, Dr. Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Akin Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, distinguished guests, dear participants, all protocols observed. It's a pleasure to see you all today, despite, of course, COVID and this virtual setting. We're delighted to welcome you to the 15th edition of the African Economic Conference, aptly themed Africa Beyond COVID-19, Acceleration Towards Inclusive Sustainable Development. No time has it been ever more important for us to focus on Agenda 2030 and the need for us to ensure that we actually stay focused on the goals as they are laid ahead of us. Agenda 2030, I think, was set and designed before we had the COVID-19 crisis. But today with the COVID-19 crisis, there is one thing from the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 that says we should leave no one behind. If ever that was very important, it is today with COVID-19. We have to ensure that as we think about how we build forward better, how we build forward together, the conversations around inclusive and sustainable development have become even more important. I must agree with everybody else that says that COVID-19 has dealt a devastating blow to the African continent. We are at our first recession in 25 years. The world has seen a recession like we have never seen in 100 years. So collectively, this is a global public bad, and we must collectively understand how we get out of it. Three things are going to be important for how we manage to navigate the exit from this crisis. The first thing, as our Secretary General has always talked about, is how we do it in a sustainable way, how we ensure that as we come out of this crisis, we come out of this crisis ensuring that we leave the climate better than we saw it. The good news, again, about COVID-19 is that it has helped actually reduce pollution in many parts of the world. The difficult part of it is going to be the people part, the sustainability part, the climate part, we may know how to do. The people part, the inclusive part, ensuring that everybody comes out by 2030 of this crisis much better, is going to be much more difficult. We are in an economy, and the African economy, 70% of our workers are informal. And therefore, we do not know how to find them when there is a disaster, when there is a shock. This is a shock like we have never seen before. This is a shock for which we do not have the tools and the policies to address immediately. And so we must be innovative. And we're hoping that all the different papers and submissions that have been put together today will ensure us and give us some new insights and some new ideas about how, we can actually respond to some of this. We have 36 papers that are going to be dealing with the conversations around the pathway to sustainable development or the exit from the crisis. I have no doubt that hopefully in some of those papers, this big and difficult question about inclusiveness, about ensuring that we don't leave more people in the next decade falling into poverty than we had when we began the decade, is going to be very important. I want to also make sure that I thank our co-conveners, the African Development Bank and the United Nations Development Program, that together with us continue to talk about inclusiveness, about people, and about ensuring that Africa is not the continent that ends up with more poor people than it is the one that comes out with more prosperity. And finally, and the third thing we need to talk about is governance. COVID-19 has exposed a lot of the fragments and fractures of our societies. We know that we've seen it in South Africa, we've seen it in Kenya, and we've seen it in many other places. The resources that we will get to finance this recovery are going to be critically important because we are not getting enough. Africa has asked for $100 billion every year for the next 3 years. Our heads of states and our leaders have put together themselves about $49 billion to respond to the crisis, but the international community, because of the weakness in multilateralism, has not responded as it should. Therefore, we need to make use of the resources, of our own resources to respond to this crisis. The best way to make use of our own resources to ensure that they're used transparently, efficiently, and effectively. And I think this is going to be the biggest challenge for the continent as we begin to think of how we grow out of COVID-19, is how, first of all, an inclusive and sustainable development. Secondly, how we make sure that we don't, in the next 10 years, leave more people poorer. When we talk about the informal sector, when we talk about more people being poorer, we are really referring to the youth on the continent. We are referring to women on the continent. We must ensure that those are not the ones who end up 10 years later when we begin to write about this crisis as the ones who have suffered the most. But that will not happen if we cannot strengthen our governance systems, if we cannot be more effective, we cannot be more efficient. It should not cost what it costs for us to build the power plants we need to industrialize the continent. It should not be too expensive to ensure that no woman on the continent dies in childbirth and that health services are effective. The value that we're putting into it. Education, education, education. We have seen with the COVID-19 crisis that our education systems are weak and stretched. We are spending a lot of resources on education on the continent today. The question is, are we spending them efficiently? Are we spending them effectively? And what are the governance systems around those? I think these three themes for conversation are really what we hope this African Economic Conference in its 15th edition is going to be talking about. Everybody will remember this 15th edition of the African Economic Conference as the one that begins to tell us how we build forward. Can we build forward? How should we build forward? And when will we begin to anticipate a recovery? So I hope that as we have these conversations today, beginning, of course, and we're extremely delighted that we're going to have at the end of the opening session, Her Excellency President Sahle-Work, a message from her, one of the second most populous country on the continent, to tell us how she sees us coming out of the crisis and what are the prospects for Africa as we get out of the. But hopefully, when we look back at what our conversations today and throughout this year, that we will, as the Economic Commission for Africa, as the African Union Commission, as the UNDP, for how we build forward with more transparency, more inclusiveness, more accountability, how we can ensure that we meet the challenges of the high fives for the African Development Bank, of course, for the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030, and for our collective continent, how we reach our aspirations for Agenda 2063 by this first 10-year milestone. To this end, I trust that your research pieces will provide innovative solutions and insights for policymakers. I am confident that Africa has a variety of best practices and lessons garnered from confronting various pandemics. We've never confronted one this big, but we have lessons from the different ones that have hit us in different parts of our continent, from the Sahel to Ebola, of course, to the cholera outbreaks, to the climate disasters in East Africa. We have examples of success, which we must build upon. We're therefore looking forward to your deliberations over the next 3 days to share your analytical perspectives, findings, and more importantly, how African countries can build back better, avoiding the pitfalls that COVID-19 has brought to the surface. I therefore wish you very fruitful discussions and look forward to a very informative report with recommendations from African countries and for all our stakeholders. Thank you very much for your attention.
And that was Vera Songwe, the UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Now, for the opening remarks from the African Development Bank, Hanan Morsy, the Director for Macroeconomic Policy, Forecasting and Research Department at the African Development Bank, will do the honors from the African Development Bank.
Her Excellency Ms. Sahle-Work Zewde, President of the Republic of Ethiopia, Honorable Ministers, Ms. Vera Songwe, Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of United Nations Commission for Africa, Ms. Ahuna Konwe, Assistant Administrator and Director General for Africa, United Nations Development Program, and His Excellency Professor Victor Harrison, Commissioner for Economic Affairs, ambassadors and heads of diplomatic missions, researchers, scholars from Africa and the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm delighted to deliver these remarks on behalf of President Adesina, the President of the African Development Group, who is unable to be with us this morning. And however, he asked me to convey his warm welcome and best wishes for productive deliberations in finding solutions to the COVID pandemic and to help in economic policy making. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this year's conference, Africa Beyond COVID, Accelerating Toward Inclusive and Sustainable Development, is of utmost importance to provide solutions to global health crisis we face today. As of end November, the world has seen more than 62 million confirmed COVID cases, resulting in about 1.5 million deaths. Africa had slightly more than 1.5 million confirmed cases, with about 35,000 deaths. The daily number of newly confirmed cases peaked in Africa in July, but the situation could get worse again. Beyond the tragedy of this pandemic, direct human loss, there are numerous significant economic consequences. These include the sustainability challenges for a large number of African countries, permanently closed businesses, long-term employment losses and scars from that, and very importantly, lost education opportunities. These wide-ranging consequences make the deliberations of this year's conference critical for the policymakers and development partners tasked with forging sound macroeconomic policies for quick recovery. The full impact of this pandemic and when it might end is difficult to predict, given the multiple resurgences of the virus across countries. However, there is hope in promising efficacy of the various vaccines under development, hope in lessons being learned from this global health crisis on how to harness digital technologies to shape our work environment and to ensure business continuity. And yes, hope in advances in economic research on the COVID-19 crisis, which this conference is proudly part of. Most challenging to policymakers and development partners in the aftermath of this pandemic is that there is no silver bullet solution to the disruptive impact of the virus. Emerging evidence shows that these impacts are not equally distributed across or even within countries. Some countries or segments of society may be experiencing effects that they are ill-equipped to handle. This is worrying particularly for African countries where governance systems face many challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, the rapid shutdown across the globe throughout this year to mitigate the pandemic impact have led to decline in almost every country's economic growth. It's projected that economic growth is likely to drop by 3.4% in Africa this year. And the rapid recovery is potentially uncertain due to the virus spontaneous resurgence in some of the countries that had registered tremendous efforts to reduce the spread. As the pandemic continues to disrupt the economies, governments are stepping in with relief efforts to keep them afloat. While necessary, this unfortunately exacerbated many countries' debt situations. The situation is particularly worrying in African economies, where the debt to GDP ratio is expected to rise by about 10% of GDP since the onset of the pandemic. Compared with 2019, foreign direct investment flows to Africa are projected to fall in 2020 by 40%. Official development assistance flows to fall by 10% and remittances to fall by 9%. Furthermore, some estimates indicate that COVID-19 restrictions are projected to contract African exports by 17%, resulting in a drop of 5% in public revenue losses. In Africa, the pandemic has had serious impact on the informal sector, which accounts for 80% of all non-agricultural employment and employs 90% of women and 83% of men. And youth are disproportionately at risk. More than 1 in 6 young people in Africa has lost their jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. And given the strong representation of females in hard-hit sectors like tourism, most of these job losses are suffered by women. We are at risk of reversing decades worth of progress in labor market gender equality. The COVID-19 has also played havoc with education systems, threatening to erase decades of progress in this area too, and disproportionately harming the poorest and most vulnerable communities. In Africa, 9.8 million students to few urban schools. The population has access to internet connectivity. About 24 million additional students are likely to drop out of school next year, especially in developing countries, where the annual pre-COVID-19 education financing gap was estimated at $148 billion and is expected to increase by up to 1/3. Ladies and gentlemen, on the positive side, the pandemic has inspired innovative approaches in education sector and e-commerce economy to ensure continuity in the provision of education. Online classes, once exclusive to universities, are now the new normal for kindergarten, primary, and secondary students. The digital economy is increasingly gaining ground. Emerging evidence shows that 64% of third-party online marketplaces have seen a spike in sales, although 58% of e-commerce companies selling products or services online have recorded a drop on a monthly sales. With these few examples of disproportional impact of the COVID crisis, we as policymakers, researchers, development partners, and champions for policy change are challenged to design solutions that leave no country or no community behind. For its part, the African Development Bank has deployed a mix of financing instruments to support regional member countries to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact, including by building a strong and resilient health defense system for Africa. Early this year, the health crisis evolved into global pandemic. Africa had 9 hospital beds per 10,000 people, compared to the global average of 27. 10 physicians per 100,000 people, and 2 labs with requisite capacity to conduct COVID-19 tests, and was importing up to 90% of its pharmaceutical and medical supplies. With such a weak healthcare system, one would have only expected the worst for Africa. But there have been concerted efforts to build relatively strong systems to prevent the pandemic from spreading like wildfire. By July 2020, the African Development Bank had approved about $3.4 billion to support regional member countries under crisis response facility, of which 97% was in the form of crisis response budget support operations. These operations are designed to strengthen health systems, to facilitate safe reopening of the economies, enhance economic resilience to protect jobs, and strengthen social protection systems to protect vulnerable communities and businesses. To date, the African Development Bank has approved $106.4 million to support regional economic communities.
Now, for a goodwill message on this conference and what African economies can do to build resilience, we'll have Professor Victor Harrison, is the Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission.
Thank you, Chair. Her Excellency Sahle-Work, Zewde, Madame la Présidente de la République fédérale de l'Éthiopie, Dr. Hanan Morsy, Director of AfDB, Miss Ashuna Asia, Regional Director of UNDP, and my sister, Vera Song, Executive Secretary of UNITED, National Economic Commission for Africa, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Due to prior commitment, His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of African Union Commission, cannot honor this conference with his presence. He therefore asks me to represent him and to pass on to you his best wishes. The theme addressed by this 2020 edition of African Economic Conference is a timely topic. Indeed, the question of Africa's future after the COVID-19 pandemic is crucial, and all Africans are called upon to express themselves on this subject. For my part, I will begin by sharing with you a brief review on the joint continental strategy for COVID-19 by mentioning some of the initiatives implemented by African Union in collaboration with Africa CDC and other partners such as AfDB and Afreximbank to limit the spread of a disease and mitigate its negative impact on our populations and economies. For instance, the following initiatives and the role have been established or played. 1, the Partnership to Accelerate COVID-19 Testing Pact, Trace, Test, and Track, CDC T3, that aims to strengthen capacity to test the COVID-19 across Africa. 2, the COVID-19 Response Special Fund that aims at raising resources to strengthen the continental response to COVID-19. 3, the Africa Medical Supplies, a platform digital purchasing system that will allow African governments to procure diagnostics and medical supplies. 3, coordination and capacity building. And 4, distribution of medical equipment donations from partners to member states. At the AUC level, the Department of Social Affairs and Economic Affairs jointly organized 5 conferences with the Ministers of Finance and Health in order to coordinate response actions to the pandemic with member states. These conferences have, among others, highlighted the importance of rapid access to financial resources and investments. During their meeting in April this year, African ministers of finance identified a need in $100 billion to deal with the pandemic and $100 billion for economic recovery in April. In this regard, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, Chair of African Union, appointed 5 special envoys to support the continent in its efforts to mobilize financial resources and negotiate the debt issues for the continental fight against COVID-19, the maintenance of economic activities, and the recovery of African economies. The Department of Economic Affairs, on its part, has supported the action of special envoys by advocating and negotiating on the issue of African debts and the mobilization of additional resources on various high-level discussion fora, including the work of the working groups in the financing for development in the area of COVID-19 and beyond. The department, indeed, I cultured the discussion of the group of COVID-19 and debt vulnerability, and I requested on behalf of African Union Commission the cancellation of debts or write-down for all African countries to avoid payment default and create space for SDG investment, and extension of the moratorium debt for at least 3 years to ensure smooth economic recovery, including buying back commercial debts. And the issues or reallocation of SGRs or other mechanics, debt swaps, for example, debt for climate adaptation swaps initiative, debt exchange or reprofiling, and other instruments. Since the G20 has not yet succeeded in securing the full participation of all their private and bilateral public sector creditors in DSSA, the outcome of the negotiations will certainly await. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, the decline of external funding, including ODA, FDA, and remittances, highlighted the urgency to mobilize adequate, stable, predictable, and long-term resource internally to finance the Africa's development, including improving domestic resource mobilization and fight against IFFs. In this regard, I'd like to inform you that the ministers of finance, economic planning, and integration, and governors of central bank of member states of African Union met virtually on the occasion of the first extraordinary session of Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration on 4th December 2020, emphasized the need to actively participate in the global tax debate on the digital economy and stem illicit financial flows from Africa. During the meeting, a joint AUC-EU JEZ project IFFs was launched in order to build capacity of a member state and increase accountability of public institutions regarding IFFs. The COVID-19 pandemic also reminds us the vulnerability of all economies to external shocks. Time is coming to rethink Africa's development trajectory. Let's make this pandemic be an opportunity to build more indigenous and resilient economies, and this ensure Africa's autonomy. The report of Economic Affairs of AUC, with contributions from all other AUC departments, propose policy actions comprising short, medium, and long term in this direction. Moreover, that the world is moving into a new direction. A new world economic order is currently emerging. African countries should equip young people with the skills necessary to attract multinational enterprises and other players in all the trade. It also provides the opportunity to harness digitalization, transform locally the enormous natural resource, and the use of a transfer of technology effectively to fully implement the IFCFTA and become self-reliant, stop importing processed goods. To conclude, I would like to appeal to all stakeholders to work together for the acceleration toward inclusive and sustainable development in Africa. No one has the exclusivity of knowledge, and it is in the complementarity of ideas that we will succeed in responding to Africa's challenges. I thank you.
And that was Professor Victor Harrison, is the Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission. Now, to kick things off and for the official opening of the 2020 edition of the Africa Economic Conference, jointly organized by the African Development Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, which is going to be held virtually from the 8th to 10th of December this year. We have none other than Her Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ethiopia, in the person of Sahle-Work Zewde, who will officially open the Africa Economic Conference for 2020.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address this distinguished gathering at a time when the world has faced one of the deepest shocks to our way of life. Under normal conditions, we would have all been here in Addis Ababa, but COVID-19 has dictated the current mode of conference. Though we miss you in Ethiopia, we're grateful to have found a way of continuing to deliberate on how to develop Africa better in a sustainable way. This conference is timely in bringing together leading thinkers and practitioners in the continent to examine the impact of COVID-19, the responses to it, and how we can collectively rebuild and refocus our efforts to move our continent back to the path of sustainable development and achieve our aspirations of the Africa we want. In Africa, according to some estimates, economic growth is forecast to show significant contraction in 2020. The poverty numbers continue to be revised upward depending upon the intensity and duration of the pandemic. For instance, the pandemic has exacerbated the welfare conditions of a large proportion of informal workers who constitute approximately 80% of the total workforce. Many Africans do not have access to social protection and face substantial gender inequalities when it comes to access to education and health, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Let me illustrate this perspective with some stark figures. Africa had the world's highest adolescent fertility rate at 99 births per 1,000 women, as well as the world's lowest female secondary school enrollment. In Africa, adolescent girls and young women represented a quarter of all new cases of HIV in 2019, equivalent to 4,500 of them acquiring HIV every week. Moreover, adolescent girls and young women are more than twice as likely to acquire HIV as their male peers. Alarmingly, nearly 34 million girls, equivalent to 38% of girls between ages of 12 to 14 and 61% of girls ages of 15 to 17 are not in secondary school. Almost half of the estimated 24 million learners around the world at risk of not returning to school are girls and young women. 24% of young women 14 to 24 years old are not in employment, education, or training. For young women who work, the conditions, pay and income security their jobs offer are poor. Faced with limited family resources, girls are more likely than boys to be withdrawn from school, thus widening the literacy gender gap. Plan International and UNESCO have warned of potential for increased dropout rates, which will disproportionately affect adolescent girls, further entrenching gender gaps in education, and lead to increased risk of sexual exploitation, early pregnancy, and early and forced marriage. Ladies and gentlemen, these gender gaps are systemic and have persisted for years. But as the pandemic redirects resources to COVID-19 related solutions, including vaccines, attention to addressing existing inequalities will diminish, as will resources for non-COVID diseases such as HIV, malaria, and TB. Against this background, let me propose some solutions on context and gender to complement our deliberations on how we can rebuild better from COVID-19. The Africa strategic response to COVID, the leveraging of the continental free trade area as a business opportunity, the pooled procurement of COVID health products as exemplified by the African Medical Supply Platform, the significant uptake at the continental level of a digital future and its positive spillovers on employment and human capital, just to name a few. To combat COVID-19, Ethiopia leveraged on Health Extension Program, which is one of the most innovative community-based health schemes. It is founded on idea that access to and the quality of primary health care in rural communities can be improved substantially through the transfer of health knowledge and skills to households through the training and empowerment of community-based health workers and volunteers. This program has transformed the approach to disease prevention, family and maternal health, vaccinations, and hygiene. It has enabled Ethiopia to expand primary health care coverage to the entire country and has vastly improved health outcomes. Hence, innovative thinking can offer local solutions to systemic challenges. Additionally, we in Africa have a unique tradition of solidarity and mutual support in times of difficulty. We have a culture of sharing whatever we may have as a community. This is a great value that should not be overlooked in our suggested solutions. For instance, here in Ethiopia, during the peak of the COVID pandemic, we have mobilized the community around the motto called Gebeta Magarat, roughly translated as sharing your food. This movement has shown amazing mutual community support to poorer members of the community. Therefore, we need to tap into our time-honored Pan-African values in addition to solutions based on conventional analysis. Africa's responses and plans for building back better for this COVID-19 pandemic towards a sustainable development trajectory need to have gender considerations at their core. It is with pleasure that I note that within this African Economic Conference, space has been provided for showcasing African women thought leadership and recognizing women's role as policy designers and proponents rather than simple beneficiaries. Engaging women in building back better from COVID-19 will require dedicated and increased fiscal resource allocation to smart investments in health, education, and consequently their contribution to development. For example, the costs of high rates of adolescent childbearing range from 1 to 30% of annual GDP across African and other low and middle income countries. These estimates represent a young mother's foregone income during the course of their life. The lack of educational and economic opportunities that result in women's diminished labor force participation is estimated to cost Africa $60 billion in economic losses every year. On the other hand, Africa could gain a lot more per year through multi-sectoral investments in adolescents and youth, especially girls, by capitalizing on demographic windows of opportunity. I have no doubt that the dozens of research papers you will discuss present additional perspectives for building back better from COVID-19 to ensure genuine inclusion of all segments of society for resilience and sustainable development of our Mother Africa. I wish you fruitful deliberations.
And that was Her Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ethiopia, Sahle-Work Zewde, officially opening the Africa Economic Conference for 2020. This year's theme is looking at Africa beyond COVID-19, accelerating towards inclusive and sustainable development. And that's all for today's coverage. And thank you so much for watching. I'm Kenneth Igbomo, and have a wonderful day.